back up to 61 billion. We had the debate week after week after week. The numbers continue to shrink. 61, 38, 33, and then last Thursday they said, hey, it's time to vote. We've got to deal with the president. We've got a deal. And I was the first one to start looking really closely at the deal when it got done. Congressional Budget Office, nonpartisan. Hate to tell you numbers because they get confusing. I said, tell me, bottom line, how much do they cut in this deal? $352 million. That's a lot, but not in Washington. And it's not a 20 billion, it's not 25, it's not 38, it's not 61, it's not $100 billion. I said, not good enough. It did pass. We didn't add $100 billion like they talked about, but we didn't make the cuts. That's because they're starting not to listen to us. But we have changed the discussion. But the battle has taught me one thing, and Joe Miller indicated. The warning shot was fired today. The folks that are loaning us money and rating our credit said, you better be careful. We're about ready to downgrade the creditworthiness of our entire nation unless something is done about a $14.3 trillion deficit. We've started the discussion. We've turned the ship, but it's moving very slow. The point being is $14.3 trillion. Don't forget that figure. Don't forget $1.6 trillion. That's the debt for this year alone. We have some work to do. But we are starting that battle, that discussion. That's not about us here. It's not about us here, unless you're these young folks. Because you look a liberal in the eye, and so are you ready and willing to enslave your children for generations to come to foreign nations? Are you ready and willing? No, we're not. One thing we have to note as well, looking at regulation and control. We can talk about the budget. We can talk about spending money. But there are millions of folks in Washington that don't spend any money, but they control your lives. That's called bureaucrats. Particularly at the EPA is a great example. Whether it's appointing czars or emboldening bureaucrats, this president has committed himself to one thing, enhancing his influence not only over your pocketbook, but over every single part of your daily lives. You think your gas prices are high enough? This administration is committed to one thing about gas prices, and that's to make them higher. I am not kidding. The EPA is dedicated to making sure to raise your gas prices, raise your electricity bills, raise every one of your utility rates because they have a firm belief, and they're very clear about that, a firm belief that fossil fuels are a product of the past. So if you're ready and willing to pay $5 gasoline, the EPA is ready and willing to deliver. Speaking of the White House, I had a representative drop by my office in January. They do that with all freshmen. They probably drew a straw, said, who got the short straw? Let's send him to Huelskamp's office. And so they came by and just poking the face in the door and say, hey, we're from the White House. If you ever need anything, we're here to help. And I ran down the hallway and said, no, come back in. Pulled out a chair. I said, hey, I want to talk to you about something. I've got a number of things. I've been waiting for this day for a long time. I asked him about 3 things. But the main thing I asked him about, I said, you know what? I said, we sent our former governor to Washington. And in recent days, it's come to our attention that perhaps she's been granting exemptions to your most favorite plan for health care. And at that time, in early January, they refused to say who was being exempted from Obamacare. If it's such a great thing, Mr. President, if it's such a great thing, Ms. Secretary, why have you now granted more than 1,000 exemptions to Obamacare? Over 1,000 exemptions. I tell you what, I got a better plan. Let's exempt everybody and start over. Hey! Plain and simple. Plain and simple plan. But let's look at this very carefully. The discussion over Obamacare is not about health care. It's not about health care. The discussion about Obamacare is about liberty. It's all about liberty. For if your federal government, let's roll back a little bit. Let's remember the history of the Constitution. The Constitution wasn't written to protect these folks here. The Constitution was written principally, before the amendments, it was written for one thing. It's because the states feared the power of the central government. They feared the power of Washington. They feared a federal government. And isn't that amazing? The very folks that wrote this Constitution, they were the ones, they knew they'd be in charge. And they said, no, we're going to limit the power of the federal government. And they wrote a Constitution to do specifically that. Then along comes this administration and says, you know that Commerce Clause? Did you know that was really meant to allow the federal government to do anything it wishes? To do anything it wishes, to turn it upside down. It is so bad that the federal judge that ruled Obamacare constitutional, one in Washington, D.C., said, you know, the Commerce Clause allows us about anything we want to do, including regulating, get this, including regulating and controlling mental activity. I am not kidding. That's in the ruling from a federal judge in Washington, D.C. They have the authority to control mental activity. Many times, given this administration, I would like to control the lack of mental activity. But that's another discussion. The control discussion about Obamacare is about liberty. It's about liberty. And hopefully soon, I had hoped it would happen today, but the Supreme Court of the United States did not have the courage to expedite a challenge to a federal health care law. We will have to wait many more months before that happens. But that will happen. The discussion will happen at the federal level, I believe, before the next election. Recently, I was at a town hall in Hutchinson, Kansas. I have the strange belief from many of my folks that's different from many of my colleagues in Washington, because I believe the power in this nation comes from you, the people. And I say, if you want to represent the people, you got to talk to them. In the last few months, I've had 40 town halls. And if some of my colleagues have been there 10 years, they probably haven't had but 40 town halls in 10 years. But that's the way it works. That's the way our systems work. That's the way the House of Representatives is to work, is to listen to you. But I have one question for you. And I asked this at a town hall in Hutchinson, Kansas. I hope you give a good answer, because I didn't like the answer I saw in Hutchinson, Kansas. But the question is this. Who here believes the next generation of Americans will be better off than your generation? Who believes the next generation will be better off? Hold up your hand if you think that.
Right here. No. Cook Brothers, rule.
I firmly believe that if we do our job, and I'm talking about you, not the guys in Washington, if we do our job, we will remember 2011, not about any of the names of anybody here, but we will remember 2011 and 2012 as the year we restored the American dream. Can we do that? Yes! We have to. We can, we must. I don't believe the American dream is dead, because American people are here. They're engaged. That's what's happening, and that's what frightens the holy heck out of Washington, D.C., to see people showing up and asking for one thing, and that's less of Washington. One of our Republican leaders, and again, back on the bad news just a little bit, one of our Republican leaders was encouraging us to vote for the miniature budget cuts, and again, I appreciate the change in discussion. And he said, you know, members of Congress, Republican members, about 240 of us in the room. He said, you know, there's a time to lead and there's a time to listen as a politician. A time to lead and a time to listen. Think about that. This gentleman was encouraging us, especially the freshmen, to vote for these miniature cuts, which were much below than was promised, and said there's a time to lead and a time to listen. The point being was, America said that wasn't enough. This leader said, don't listen to them. One of the top leaders in our Congress said there's a time to lead and time to listen, and implicitly, I'm not supposed to listen if you don't agree with us. That is backwards. That is not the way it should be. Do you agree with me? Friends, leadership is not ignoring the will of the American people. Leadership is not refusing to listen to the American people. No, real leadership is listening to and doing the will of the American people. There's still a lot of typical Washington left, and there'll be a lot of years to go. That's why we've got a Constitution. Our founders knew that. They recognize the nature of government is to ever grow and expand and take your liberty away. And it's ever vigilance. But typical Washington is still around. But no matter what we talk about today, whether there's a $14.3 trillion debt or a downgrade, potential downgrade in our creditworthiness, which will raise up our cost. No matter what we talk about, out of control czars. Did you know we defunded czars in the budget? I had an amendment to do that. That was great. That was great. Of course, the president, he said, I don't care. I don't care. I'm going to ignore that as well. At least he's being consistent. At least he's being consistent. But no matter what we talk about here, no matter what happens, this is still the greatest nation in the world. This is still the greatest nation in the world. And people from around the world, around the globe are watching us. They're watching us. They have for generations, for centuries. They are watching us. This is not just about us. It's not about our children or grandchildren. This is about the entire world. Because if freedom is dead in our country, to where will we go? We must revive and restore the American dream, and that we will do with people like you staying involved, watching us, trusting but verifying every chance you get. Again, thank you. God bless you. And God bless America.